The Blessing House, a tale for the autumn season, written by Joanne de Simone. It had been going on for months. A moving truck arrives, happy people move in, and in no time, those same people hastily load up the truck and rush off as if escaping a fire or some similar catastrophe. Observing this continual spectacle from behind seemingly closed blinds of their home just across from the Blessing House on Bramble Lane were the Winnebeck sisters, Hannah and Cora. Since the Winnebeck house was slightly angled on its plot, the sisters had virtual, unobstructed views of all the comings and goings in the neighborhood. The sisters were quite young when they lost their parents to an influenza epidemic that ravaged New England during the Depression era. Hannah was left in charge of running the house, and therefore, the money. Town legend has it that during World War II, Hannah had been courted by a dashing Army Air Corps pilot. Hannah was, well, homely, and already in her mid-20s, and unaccustomed to receiving admirers, whereas Cora, a blossoming beauty, had her pick of beaux. Hannah was both thrilled and surprised when the handsome airman declared his honorable intentions by asking her hand in marriage. Almost immediately after the engagement was announced in the Musgrove Gazette, the neighbors were shocked to see the brave war hero running for his life down Bramble Lane, and close on his heels were the Winnebeck sisters, charging, waving frying pans and shouting, "Scamp! Scoundrel! Rapscallion!" Our flying hero had made advances on Cora, and to his dismay had to face the wrath of both sisters. Hannah never knew what prompted her to cut short her library visit that day, except to say that something made her return home just in time to witness the betrayal. It was called the Blessing House. It stood on the corner of Main Street and Bramble Lane for more than a century. Records in the clerk's office of the small town of Musgrove, Vermont, indicated that it was owned or handled by a law firm consisting of many names followed by the Latin phrase, et al., which meant there were even more lawyers who were not worthy of mention. The Blessing House was in the state of an estate, the estate of A.J. Blessing. At present, the house was unoccupied, but that was not apparent to passer-by. The taxes were paid on time each year, and the grounds were in good order. To all appearances, the house was well tended. Nothing in its exterior demeanor revealed an empty house. It bore a sense of life, even though no one lived in it since the death of Aidan Jonah Blessing in 1878. But no one on Bramble Lane, or anyone else in Musgrove, had ever seen a housekeeper, or gardener, or window washer, painter, or handyman anywhere near the Blessing House. It was true that everyone was able to recite the dates and times when well-dressed men with briefcases talked with other well-dressed men and women on the stone walkway or the porch, nodding and shaking hands. And it was front-page news when the "For Rent Inquire at Louis Rogers" sign was hammered into the front lawn. There was no need for a telephone number on the sign, for everyone in Musgrove and the entire county knew Louis Rogers. When the law firm of whomever, whatever et al. Requested the services of Rogers' realtor, Louis was especially happy to find a suitable tenant for the lovely and mysterious Blessing House. More than anyone else, Louis Rogers understood the value of the Blessing House, but it was more than that. He seemed to empathize with its charismatic aura. Louis was the unofficial photographer for the Musgrove Gazette, and his camera was to him like the pen is to a writer. His photographs were so vivid, they seemed to tell an entire story in simple black and white images. Louis, now in his late 70s, knew mostly everything about the town of Musgrove, and remembered clearly that fateful day that hurled the Winnebeck sisters into spinsterhood. Never forgot Hannah sprinting past his office as if someone or something was pushing her on. He also never forgot the story his father, Charles, told him about Mistler the baker. The Mistlers lived directly across from the Winnebecks and next to the Blessing house. Walter Mistler was a baker with a wife and 4 daughters. To Walter Mistler, bread was life. His wife Joanna used to tell her friends at the sewing circle that Walter wept with joy every time a new loaf came out of the oven. Evenings at the Mistler house were quiet. Joanna read to the girls. Walter had what his wife called a half-hobby. He collected clocks. He's entitled, his wife would relate to her lady friends, but would add, I just wish he'd get them to work. The entire Mistler house, and even the bake shop, which occupied the front 2 rooms of an old Victorian, were filled with clocks, on tables, on mantels, and all the walls were busy with clocks. Joanna had to buy a curio cabinet just to display her family photographs, and kept the key hidden. None of the clocks worked. They were all exquisite and admired by everyone, but each one was like a sleeping beauty, and the townspeople agreed with Mrs. Mistler that since the clocks were so finely crafted, they deserved a chance to show off their talents a little. But Mistler was content with his bread and strudels and pleased to collect his silent lovelies. Late one night, a collective combustion of chimes, whistles, cuckoos, and bells clamored all at once, propelling everyone from a sound sleep. Mistler, dumbstruck at first, charged his family to wait upstairs while he investigated. He went down the stairs, each step bringing the crashing blare closer. He walked curiously toward the bake shop, and from the door he could see all the clocks, each alive with its own music. Then suddenly he smelled it. Fire! He raced swiftly into the shop. A fire had started in the oven, but he was able to put it out straight away. The clocks stopped sounding, but Mistler hadn't noticed until the fire was out and all was safe. Collecting himself, he looked around at the clocks, now as silent as before, and took one of them off the wall and examined it. For a few moments he tried to get it to chime, but the clock did not work. When Mistler returned upstairs, Joanna, clutching her nightgown and trying to keep calm for the sake of her 4 shaking daughters, asked with eyes bugged out, "What was that?" Mistler shrugged. "I don't know, but it's all right now. Go back to bed." The next day, Mistler baked a spectacular braided challah bread and placed it in the front window as a thankful offering to something even he wasn't sure of. Louis Rogers was a young man at the time, and when he learned about the mystery of the clocks, he was intrigued and was compelled to photograph the baked offering in Mistler's window. The shadow that appeared in the photo next to the bread was shrugged off as poor lighting. Over the years, Charles related the Mistler clock wonder to his young son Louis many times as a bedtime story, while Louis clung to the snapshot, captivated, but most of all, it was the shadow in the picture that inspired him to take photographs that told magical tales. There have been many mysteries of benevolence in the town of Musgrove in the 70 years since the Mistler clocks came to life for a moment. The widow Finch was preparing a stew and tasted a beef cube for tenderness. The cube lodged in her throat. When it became apparent to the widow that pounding on her own chest was doing no good, she began to slump to the floor. But before she fell, something grabbed her around the middle, lifted her up, and continued to squeeze her again and again. All at once, the beef cube shot out of her mouth and across the room, and the widow Finch found herself breathing more easily, holding on to a chair in total bewilderment. And it was just recently that the ever-watchful Winnebeck sisters told Louis Rogers that they saw little Gracie Haight stop in front of the Blessing house facing the Forsythia, giggling and nodding, then waved bye-bye to the bush and continued walking down Bramble Lane. Louis Rogers was troubled these days. He, too, watched prospective tenants come and go at the Blessing House, and felt a responsibility beyond his realtor duties to bring the right person to the enchanting house. Louis decided to spend the night in the Blessing House, but knew it was something that compelled him. Louis arrived at the Blessing House and opened the door with a key that was attached to a tag that read simply, "Blessing." He stood in the front vestibule and looked through the arch and was able to see most of the first floor. When he was a boy, he would peer through the first-floor windows. It was never done in mischief, but instead with the kind of respect that one pays when visiting a dearly departed's grave. Always he held an inexplicable reverence for the house. His previous visits to the Blessing House consisted of brief walk-throughs while escorting prospective tenants, some of them city people who wanted, or thought they wanted, the country life, nestled in New England charm. With an earnest desire to show proper deference to the Blessing House, Louis packed nothing save his camera, and did not intend to use it unless he was invited to take pictures. Funny he used the word invited, but that was his impression as he circled slowly through and around the beautiful furniture, brocaded sofas and chairs, oak tables and sideboards. Against the far wall, standing like a patriarchal monument, was a hand-carved marble mantel embracing a fireplace big enough to stand in. Chiseled in the center of the mantel was a miniature of cheerful, chubby cherubs in flight. One side of the mantel, alongside the angels, was a sculpted frame bearing the engraved initials AJB, and on the opposite end was another similarly carved frame, smooth and blank. After the first renter's exodus, Louis went in for a routine and respectful inspection, and it was all as it had always been, perfect. At first, when the law firm of names ad nauseam et al. Insisted that the house be rented and furnished, Louis was apprehensive, strangers using, yes, abusing, these glorious furnishings, and ultimately desecrating the very house itself. The lawyers did arrange for some renovation. They consulted with plumbers and electricians, but demanded only minimal change, nothing high-tech. A few electrical outlets were installed, gas lights were replaced, and the kitchen and bathroom were updated to the intent of hot and cold running water. A modest refrigerator was brought in. The icebox, however, was not discarded. It remained standing next to its replacement like a benched pitcher in the big game. It was 7 o'clock. Soon the sun would be setting, and Louis wondered what he would do all night. His enormous respect for the house would not allow him to make himself comfortable. Should he stand all night in the parlor? Well, that was just silly. He walked to one of the wing chairs near the fireplace and gingerly sat down as if he was a guest at a state dinner and was unaware of the protocol. Louis had barely sat on the slick horsehair seat when the tapestry pillow which was arranged near the back of the seat slowly slid up the back, almost to the top, and Louis felt an encouraging hand on his shoulder, gently pressing him to a more comfortable position. Quickly recovering from that unexpected welcome, he settled into the chair and decided to spend the night right there. The house was cold, and he was sorry he hadn't brought a coat. Louis tried to stay awake, to be alert, and to have the experience of the Blessing House firsthand. He already had a pretty good idea as to why the tenants fled, but he also imagined that they were not welcome because none of them understood. At some point, Louis dozed off, and his own loud snore awoke him. The room was now warm, and he felt as cozy as he would have been if tucked in an eider-down quilt. He looked over his shoulder at the fireplace. A crackling fire was roaring. He sat there and watched the glorious, perfect flames and whispered, "Thank you," and went back to sleep. While Louis Rogers was fast asleep in an armchair enjoying the hospitality at the Blessing House in Musgrove, Vermont, on the other side of the continental U.S., in an ultra-modern apartment in Portland, Oregon, Abigail Summers was trying not to listen to her neighbor, Florine, yak on about her disastrous date that evening with a fast-talking salesman pushing a promising stock. "He was only interested in selling me some smelly old stock," Flora wailed, disappointed that the salesman hadn't made the kind of pitches most women expect from a man, but feigned shock. Abigail was working on applying the final finish on a 19th century bureau when she heard the frantic knock and Florine's high-pitched squeal through the door. "Abby, I know you're in there. I can smell that awful furniture stuff from out here. Open the door, honey." Abigail wanted to hide, to pretend she wasn't home. She couldn't bear Lord knows how many hours listening to Florine's dating woes. It was especially irritating when Florine's vocalization elevated to accentuate her southern rearing. Reluctantly, Abigail opened the door, and Florine flew in and bawled, "Can you imagine, darling? He only wanted to sell me some smelly old stock," she repeated. Florine continued to lament, but Abigail was hardly listening. She made perfunctory responses as she went about cleaning up and admiring the bureau and her handiwork. Abigail Jane Summers was tired, but there was no reason to be tired. She was 29 years old and had a successful furniture refinishing business, work that allowed her to work in her own time and space. Her space, at the moment, was a furnished apartment, hideously modern, according to Abigail's sensibilities. Angular furniture, oddly shaped accessories, and containing none of the warmth and richness of the old-style pieces she loved to restore. Now, as Florine's voice came back to prominence, it was just as piercing and angled as this apartment. Abigail knew that she had to leave. Portland is a very nice place, she thought, but it was not the place. The next morning, Abigail awoke and lingered in bed for several minutes. After a while, she showered, dressed, poured herself a cup of coffee, and sat at the glass table. She took notice of the table as it perched on a metal pedestal, and she chuckled to herself. As she sat, sipping her coffee, an intention took form. That afternoon, she delivered the newly restored bureau to her customer and returned to her space-age apartment to pack. Her last task in Portland was to tell Florine that she was leaving. "I'm going to visit my Aunt Josepha in Vermont. She has been ill, and I want to spend some time with her. She's my only relative," Abigail reported. And as for Aunt Josepha, the fact was that Aunt Josepha had died the year before, leaving Abigail enough money to live moderately comfortable. And when Josepha lived, she lived in Boston. So why did Abigail say Vermont? "I never heard you talk about an Aunt Josephine," spewed Florine, miffed at not being privy to everyone's pedigree. Ignoring the mispronunciation of her favorite aunt's name, Abigail merely shrugged, having given Florine more than enough courtesy on the matter. "Well, take care. We'll talk soon." Abigail left the building, and with blind eagerness of who knows what, she leaped into her second-hand Mercedes station wagon that would chauffeur her, a suitcase of clothes, a neatly wrapped 19th century quilt, and a box of tools. She drove off. As she drove past state lines and county roads and highway signs, Abigail Summers felt more excitement inside her than she had in all her 29 years. Somewhere, deep within her, where the soul resides, a voice, the voice of truth, was telling her that she was going home. The impetuous expectation revealed no destination, but her soul's announcement was enough to trust the adventure. In the small town of Musgrove, Vermont, life went on as usual. The Musgrove Gazette reported the daily happenings, and the front page chronicled the successful rescue of a wounded goose. And on page 7 was a brief mention that the Blessing House remained tenant unfriendly. Louis Rogers, alone in his office, scratched his head as he read the cursory article. He wrung his hands, snatched up the Gazette, and threw it across the room, then sat down heavily and slouched in his chair. He did not hear the front door open, A woman's voice. "Bad news?" Louis Rogers looked up and saw a beautiful young woman standing at his threshold. An earthy beauty with red hair tinted by the heavens, with eyes the color of honey. The sunlight enveloped her in the small space, and she appeared like a vision. "Excuse me, it's just, may I help you?" asked Louis, still unable to stop staring at her. Abigail went into the office proper and closed the door behind her. "I understand you have a house for rent. I was hoping it's still available. I found it in an ad. Not a very recent ad," she replied. Louis Rogers had a soul, and at that moment it was speaking the truth to him. "Young lady, would you like to join me in a cup of coffee?" She smiled. "Why, yes, that would be very nice." Louis escorted Abigail to the Peggy's Fresh Bacon Perk, a small cafe on Main Street owned and operated by Peggy Missler, descendant of Walter Missler, the baker. Peggy had inherited her grandfather's artistry with flour and water, but never found a man to share her passion for puffed pastry, and over the years she puffed up a little herself. So she remained content to be the plump proprietor of the charming old-fashioned establishment. When they were seated, Louis inquired, "Now, I'm Louis Rogers. You say you saw an ad for the house?" Abigail put out her hand. "Abigail Summers. Yes, you see, it was strange. I'd been traveling, staying briefly in many towns across America. Yesterday, I stopped at an inn and found an ad in your local paper. It sounded like a house I would like. I'm a furniture restorer and love to be surrounded in old history," she continued, a little embarrassed that she was able to speak so freely. "I sometimes believe that I don't belong in this time. I feel out of place in the information internet cell phone world." Louis watched her as she spoke, and envisioned Abigail in a time gone by, and indeed, that is where she belonged, and where she was meant to live. He continued to look at her. Hers was a fresh face, slightly freckled, sun-washed, and her hands were conventional hands of other women in other times, who tended lovingly to her home and gardens, and who always found a way to have enough to share with everyone around her. Louis could barely contain his enthusiasm. He felt like a matchmaker, for if anyone suited the Blessing House, it was this lovely, earthy, red-haired woman with a faraway look in her honey-colored eyes. They talked for more than an hour, while plump Peggy waddled over from time to time to refill their cups and to offer some decadent dessert. It was the first time Abigail felt she could confide in someone. She saw a father-like quality in Louis and all the comforts assigned to it. She told him about her parents' traffic accident and how they died in the wreck, holding each other. Abigail thought it was most romantic to die in the arms of your beloved, she mused, as her eyes twinkled and filled up. Louis was enchanted as she continued to talk about her travels from city to city and about her furniture restoration business. It was a hobby. I was a kindergarten teacher, and nurturing young minds should have been fulfilling, but I was never happy unless I was nurturing a grain of wood on an old piece that seemed to be begging for new life. Louis understood perfectly the concept of something begging for new life. Turning practical and approaching with diplomacy, he inquired, "Forgive me, my dear, but are you able to provide for yourself?" Abigail smiled. "Mr. Rogers, I had a wonderful Aunt Josepha. She died last year." Louis raised his hand. "I did not mean to pry." Abigail shook her head. "No, please. In fact, in a way, it was Aunt Josepha that made me consider coming to Vermont. When I was leaving Portland, my neighbor asked me where I was going. I blurted out that I was going to visit Aunt Josepha in Vermont. Auntie didn't even live in Vermont, but I thought, why not? Then I saw your ad, and since there was no phone number, I drove here to see you about it." Louis reached for his hat. "And now, would you like to see the Blessing House?" It was a beautiful fall afternoon, so they walked along Main Street to the corner of Bramble Lane. The Winnebeck sisters, engaged in their season ceremonial, were setting baskets of dried flowers of faded autumn tones on their porch, then continuing to the broad lawn to place a huge cornucopia scantily filled with wooden fruit. Between their duties, the sisters managed to notice Louis Rogers and a winsome redhead walk through the front gates of the blessing house. Suddenly there was a rush of wind, and swirling around Louis and Abigail were what seemed like every fallen leaf in Vermont, lifting up, winding, whipped up like cone-shedding particles all around, and then just as suddenly the leaves dropped to the ground in one neat mound against the fence. "Is it always so windy?" asked Abigail, steadying herself after the occurrence. She hadn't noticed the tidy pile of leaves. Louis did. "Quite unusual, I'd say." The Winnebecks saw it all, but that didn't surprise them as much as what they saw when the leaves settled. They were astonished to see that the baskets on the flowers in their porch baskets were fresh and vibrant, bursting with color, yellow and red chrysanthemums. Their eyes moved to the front lawn, where the Horn of Plenty was now transformed, filled with gourds, pumpkins, corn, and winter squash spilling out in perfect symmetry. The sisters looked toward the blessing house, then at each other, and in unison smiled a wan smile and meowed, "Well." Louis unlocked the front door, and with an après-vous gesture followed Abigail into the front hall, and with childlike curiosity hastened to look at her expression of first impression. He was not disappointed, as Abigail had the wondrous look of a child on Christmas morning, beaming at the presents under the tree. Without taking another step forward, she turned to Louis. "When can I move in?" Louis grinned and clasped his hands, and with mock gentlemanly style replied, "Today, if you like. I'll inform the barristers." After completing the necessary paperwork at Louis's office, Abigail stopped to pick up a few groceries and a bottle of Muscadet. She parked her car on Main Street, a short distance from the house, and carried her few bags, along with the staples, into the front entrance. She had no desire to unpack just yet, and left her meager luggage in the front hall. Shyly, Abigail walked through, or, as she really felt, floated through the rooms of the blessing house. Louis hadn't told her anything about the history or mystery of the house. She swayed, almost to an aged waltz, from room to room. She felt welcomed. The rain started at sundown that evening, and continued as Abigail prepared her dinner table. It was a comforting rain, steady, quenching, rather protective. Odd, though, for as a child she always wanted to be protected from the rain. She remembered at that moment how she'd take all her dolls and stuffed toys to bed with her on stormy nights, making sure that they were tucked in, cozy. Yet this rain is cozy. At the thought of cozy, she was summoned to the present and thought how lovely a fire would be. There must be some firewood on the grounds, she reasoned. She started past the parlor to the front door, where she briefly glanced toward the fireplace. In it were logs, thick, meaty logs of birch and cedar, piled perfectly with sprigs of kindling spread throughout. She was sure that the fireplace was empty when she arrived, but she shrugged and thought she'd been mistaken. She lit the logs, and almost immediately they were ablaze with a fervor of reds and blues. With the warmth and glow of the fire, Abigail settled into one of the plush armchairs and sipped her wine, and nibbled on her dinner of cold roast lamb and arugula salad. "If heaven exists," she mused, "this is it, and perhaps it's the reason it's called the Blessing House." With the sound of the rain and the hypnotic effect of the glorious flames, she barely heard it. Or did she hear it? Probably a brief whip of the wind, but no, it continued like the syncopated whine of a tiny baby. She rose from the chair, cocked her head to determine the source, and walked curiously and cautiously to the front door. The faint mewing began to sound more like meowing. She opened the door slightly and looked around. Then she looked down, and looking back at her was the blackest of cats with the greenest eyes, eyes that looked enormous inserted in its drenched head. The cat sighed, this time barely audibly, almost as if it was no longer necessary to yell. Instinctively, Abigail scooped up the cat and brought it inside. While cradling the small animal, she opened one of her bags, still on the floor of the foyer, and reached for a towel and wrapped it around the cat. She went straight away back to the plush chair by the fire and nestled in with the towel-draped cat. For a few moments, Abigail and the cat snuggled in silence. The cat seemed content to be warm and still, and Abigail was happy to revisit her childhood by pretending to make one of her toys cozy on a rainy night. It wasn't long before the cat began to stir, shook off the towel, and leaped to the floor and strutted with inquisitiveness, with its tail in the air around the parlor, then springing onto a chair, then a table, then the mantel, all with the agility of a gymnast. Not more than a kitten, thought Abigail, as she watched, amused at the black cat's ability to recover from its recent crying spell. There was a modest glint of lightning, followed by a faint thunder rumble. Then Abigail heard a whisper, or had she? Not certain, she repeated aloud in an uncertain tone what she thought she heard. "Nadia?" The cat's ears went up. She turned to walk to Abigail, who repeated, "Nadia?" The cat looked up. Abigail scanned the room with her eyes, barely moving her body. "What's going on?" she thought. She looked at the little black cat that was rubbing his face against her legs. "Is that your name? Nadia?" Abigail was now certain that she heard a voice. But whose voice? And why did it murmur the cat's name? She knew she should have been frightened. Stormy night, a black cat at the door, a voice out of nowhere. Yet Abigail was not afraid. She was beguiled. The fire faded to pink embers, and the room bore a slight chill. Abigail glanced at her partially eaten dinner. She wasn't hungry anymore. The half-filled glass of wine was warm. It was still early, too early, in fact, for bed, but she felt sleepy. The house seemed to be signaling its own peculiar curfew. Abigail cleaned up the dinner setting, the little black cat following her into the kitchen. The cat was close on her heels as she brought her travel bag from the foyer into the master bedroom. Abigail changed into a plaid flannel nightgown and argyle knee socks. The adolescent bed costume was ridiculous looking, like the Mona Lisa in a USC t-shirt, but Abigail preferred comfort to frills. Before settling into bed, she surveyed the room once more. The walls were a rich, deep red. On the hardened floors was a tapestry rug in red, blue, and mustard in a looped wedding ring pattern. The heavily carved mahogany dresser and chest of drawers were appointed with ornate brassy gold knobs, and atop of them were dozens of multicolored jars and vases and jewel boxes. The bed sheets were embroidered, starched creamy linen, and the coverlet a gold-colored quilt with red piping. The heavy drapes matched the bed cover. On the nightstand, a brass bird cage housed a red fabric hummingbird. Abigail picked it up, just as she thought. She turned the key on the bottom, and the hummingbird's mouth opened and closed, while its wings flapped slightly as Fiorelise played. "Well, Nadia, if that's your name, it looks like it's me and you for tonight anyway," she shrugged. Abigail tucked herself in bed. She basked in the warmth of the ambiance of the room, the feathery pillows, the music from the birdcage slowing. Without invitation, Nadia jumped on the bed and shimmied under the quilt. Abigail now turned to one side, felt the cat cozy up to her back, and the birdcage music was replaced by Nadia's soft purring. The rain lessened to a soft drizzle as Abigail fell into a tranquil sleep. Sometime in the quiet night, while Abigail slept, the cat stirred a little, then began moving up and down Abigail's back. It seemed to grow larger with each movement. Still, Abigail slept. Within moments, the cat took on a bulky form under the blankets that was longer and broader than Abigail herself. It was the shape of a man. In an easy movement, his head appeared and occupied the pillow next to Abigail, while his muscled body lay against her in a spooning position. One of his hands cradled her waist, while the other stroked her hair. He moved his head closer to hers. He wrapped her long red hair around his face for a moment, and then, in an instant, as if the experience was overwhelming, he shrunk under the quilt, and the small mound that was Nadia returned. Her gentle purring resumed. Abigail awoke earlier than usual to a brisk fall morning. It wasn't the light peering through the curtains that induced her from a peaceful slumber. It was Nadia. The black cat had poised herself directly in front of Abigail's face, and her emerald eyes seemingly willed Abigail to open hers. "I guess you must be hungry," said Abigail in a drowsy whisper. Nadia's tail sprung up as she brushed her face against Abigail's hand. What a darling little cat, thought Abigail, but in a quick second thought reckoned that she'd have to put her outside after breakfast. She was sure that there was a no-pet policy at the Blessing House. Poor little thing, she must have been frightened by the storm. Surely she belongs to someone in the neighborhood who is probably worried about her. Abigail wondered if Nadia was really her name, or perhaps the friendly cat would answer to Fluffy or Whiskers or some such silly cat name. While she pet the cat, Abigail cooed, "Nadia?" The cat looked straight up at Abigail with direct eye contact. "I guess that's your name, all right," she thought, and again puzzled. "But how could I know that? Whose voice murmured your name?" While Nadia feasted on leftover cold lamb and skim milk, Abigail took a bath and dressed quickly, brewed some coffee in a kitchen devoid of cold steel and formica, just warm oak. The rain had stopped sometime in the night, but the autumn leaves were still wet and glistening in the morning sun. A lovely fall morning, Abigail thought, as she looked out the kitchen window, which faced the back of the Blessing House. There were several tall evergreens lining the property line, and in English style were small paths surrounded by charming little gardens, benches, and a spattering of miniature statues. As she sipped coffee and admired the grounds, she kept her hands wrapped around the cup, enjoying the heat on her hands. She spotted a squirrel running up a tree and silently vowed to buy a bag of nuts to put outside, and, she thought, some flowers for inside, yellow spider mums. Imposing on her thoughts, Nadia meowed and jumped onto the window-sill and stared out the window. Abigail looked at her. "So you're a nature lover, too," and briefly scratched Nadia's head. There was a soft rapping at the door. Nadia swiftly leapt from the sill and ran out of sight. Abigail went directly to the front door and opened it to find a curious Louis Rogers. Abigail gestured him to come inside. "Good morning. I hope I'm not intruding," he smiled. "Everything all right, then?" Abigail smiled and sighed. "Better than all right. I love this house. I feel like I belong here." Louis nodded. "I believe you do belong here. I knew it the moment I saw you." Abigail started to speak when she glanced down and noticed Nadia weaving through Louis's legs and purring loudly. Louis looked down. "Well, what do we have here?" Abigail explained tentatively the happenings of the previous night. Louis did not seem surprised, nor was he concerned with any pet policy. "Her name's Nadia, you say?" Abigail nodded, then haltingly told Louis that she heard a voice call out the cat's name. She felt very silly, but Louis did not think her silly at all. He lifted the cat. "Nadia. Very curious indeed." Abigail told him that she was just about to leave to inquire about a missing cat. Louis waved her off. "Don't bother, my dear. This little cat doesn't belong to anyone around here. Might as well keep her, if you like. She seems to belong here, too." With that, Nadia climbed out of Louis's arms and strutted into the parlor, her tail proudly pointing up. Abigail laughed. "She's a darling. She slept right up against my back all night. Frightened by the storm, I guess." Louis raised his chin, his mouth slightly ajar, and replied, "Yes, I suppose so." Then, in a paternal tone, "You'll have company. That's good," and then asked, "Do you have a moment to go over the lease?" Abigail replied, "Of course. Let's sit down at the kitchen table." They reviewed the lease together, agreed that it was in order, and Lewis offered Abigail his fountain pen to sign at the bottom of the page. Abigail signed on the line and playfully added, "And Nadia, too." Lewis blotted the signature with his personal-sized blotter, then placed the blotter ink side up on the table. He began folding the lease to replace it to his pocket when he glanced at the blotter. The name Nadia had inverted to read Aiden. Lewis looked closer at the name and then slowly looked up at Nadia, roosted on one end of the table, staring directly at him. Back at his office, Lewis took the lease out of his pocket and placed it on the desk. He then reached in for the blotter. He studied the blot that read Aiden. He lifted a pencil from the desk and jotted the cat's name on a scrap of paper. Nadia, then wrote it, reversing the letters. Aiden. He whispered the name. Aiden. Aiden. Yes, he thought. Aiden. Aiden Jonah Blessing. He leaned back in his leather chair, looked up at nothing in particular, twirled the pencil, and asked out loud, "Do you know what you're doing, my friend?" Abigail climbed the stairs to the master bedroom. The sunlight effect was even more prominent in this room. The bedroom emanated such warmth, so much so she had a desire to slip back into bed and tuck herself in for the day. Nadia was lying on the coverlet, sprawled out, looking like a feline of the highest order. Her green eyes followed Abigail's every move. Abigail started with the carved bureau, opening drawers, feeling around inside them, the chifforobe, the nightstands. They smelled faintly of bay rum. All were empty, which reminded her momentarily that she should unpack. She sat on the bed and stroked Nadia's back. She actually felt a little embarrassed, behaving like an old Snoop sister. What did she expect to find? The cat arched her back in an inviting pose. "You've certainly made yourself at home, little Nadia, haven't you?" Nadia shifted a little on the bed. Abigail spotted a small triangle of fabric peeking out from under one of the pillows. She reached for it. It was a man's white linen handkerchief bearing the initials AJB. She held it up to her face. It felt newly starched, and it smelled of bay rum, not faintly like the drawers, distinctly, seductively, as if it was just applied. She looked closely at the initials. AJB. Why, she thought, those are the same initials that are carved in the mantel downstairs. Abigail sat on the bed for a few moments, stroking the linen square, and mused on the strange but stimulating events since her arrival. Nadia was staring at her intensely. Abigail decided abruptly to unpack. She placed the handkerchief on her pillow, walked downstairs to the hall to get her bag. Back in the master bedroom, she set her bag on the foot of the bed and opened it. Well, she thought, plenty of drawer space for her meager belongings. She opened one of the top drawers of the massive rosewood bureau. The faded smell of bay rum. Arranging her underwear, Abigail's finger touched upon something that felt like paper. She ran her hand along the side of the drawer where it meets the frame. A sheet of parchment paper was against the wood, creased in the shape of the drawer. She pulled it out. She straightened it and looked at it closely. It was difficult to read. All the words seemed piled upon each other, and it appeared to have been written in two different handwritings. Then she realized it. It was two letters, written on the same paper. The reply to one letter was written in between the lines. She read the one with the earliest date first.
26 July, 1863. Dearest brother, I pray that you are well. It was clear in your last letter that your legion was about to enter into a battle that would perhaps prove to be a determining factor to end this beastly war. The mails carry at a maddeningly slow pace, and I am frightened so. I seek out news from our neighbors who might have even a vestige of information. Perhaps that is not a good practice, dear brother, as facts have a way of venturing into rumor. Aunt Gertrude took to her bed when Mrs. Jones told her about a bloody battle that took place during the early days of this month in a small Pennsylvania town. I fear that you have fought in that battle, and I pray that you are safe. Forgive me, dearest Aidan, but I do not understand why we are fighting against our own countrymen. It is true that the South is a peculiar civilization, and I do not believe in their practice of enslaving Negroes. But surely there must have been a more peaceable means to convince them to abandon the abhorrent custom. But here we are, in a terrible war, and you are far away from home. My one thought is of your safe return to Musgrove. I have, as you instructed, secured the plot of land on Bramble Lane. Keep close to your heart the dream of building our new home. I will close with fond thoughts of you and await quite impatiently good news. Your loving sister, Catherine.
Abigail then read between the lines of that letter, and it was difficult, as the words on the faded old parchment seemed to run together, except for the difference in the handwritings. October 18, 1863. Dear Catherine, sister dear, I am well. It is true that I was at Gettysburg, and I have witnessed the most horrific battle between men. Hundreds of men wounded, and much more dead, their bloody bodies lying in the greenest of fields. Such cruel irony, dear sister, to see the grass so alive cradling the wretched, bloody corpses. Alas, I was wounded, my dear, but I beg that you do not worry, as my wound was a trifle. As I contemplate on the many, many young men who will not be going home, I wonder why I was spared. I will be coming home at Christmas time for a short furlough. Bid Aunt Gertrude well, and ask her to bake a delectable apple pie for me. I shall see you both very soon indeed. In your prayers, dear sister, and God to end this war. Ever fondly, your brother, Aidan. When Abigail finished reading the letters, she sat on the bed holding the folded paper. Nadia jumped from the bed to the top of the bureau. Lost in thought, she paid very little attention to hearing a sneeze, then another, "Achoo!" In a reflex response, she whispered aloud, "Bless—" She looked up, a bit startled. Nadia was not on the bureau. Instead, there stood a man, tall with jet-black hair and a complexion toughened by summer sun, dressed in an ensemble characteristic of the latter part of the 19th century. His green eyes sparkled, and his mustache danced slightly as he finished her words. "Blessing, blessing, blessing." He sneezes again. "Don't know why I used a damned cat. They always make me sneeze. I beg your pardon." Abigail knew that a sane person would run, screaming wildly at the thought of speaking to a phantom, but there she sat, gazing up at an extraordinary-looking man, speaking plainly and matter-of-factly in a resonant baritone. His manner of speech was more Old British than New England, and the conversation was as natural as if they had talked about a cat and other commonplace topics many times before. It seemed just as natural for Abigail to continue. "You are Aidan, from this letter." He stood, arms folded across his waistcoat, and replied, "Aidan Jonah Blessing, born February 6, 1840, died, regretfully, December 19th, 1878. Abigail, still planted securely on the bed, offered, "Nice to meet you, I think." Aidan continued, pointing to the letter, "Bloody war, of no use, really. They still go on, and from what I hear, nothing has changed. Wars are fought, men die, and unless one reads the history books, damned if anyone remembers why they fought at all." Abigail began to speak, but Aidan quickly added, "No, my dear, I survived the war." He sneezed again. Abigail asked, "What about your trifle injury? What was that?" Aidan slapped the calf on his left leg. "Lost my leg, right here. It was damned inconvenient at the time." Abigail, confused, pointed. "But your leg looks fine." Aidan laughed. "That's death for you, full of surprises. After I died, well, there it was, good as new." Abigail mumbled. "Losing your leg was a trifle?" Aidan shrugged. "No use upsetting my family. They were going to see it for themselves soon enough." "And your sister?" she asked. Aidan's face grew grim as he sighed heavily. "Catherine, a good, kind girl. She died in January 1864, swiftly, of typhoid fever. I was grateful to have celebrated Christmas with her." He pointed to the letter. "Catherine was 28 years old when she died. A spinster, as it were. Terrible word, spinster. Used to imply that something vital about her went wasted. I'm sure if she had lived, she would have married, eventually. Dearest Catherine. A bit too trusting, for she met up with several scamps that were only courting her money. I tried my best to protect her." He lightened a little. "Have you met our neighbors, the Winnebeck sisters?" Abigail shook her head. "Funny pair they are. They watch everything, but they're quite harmless and devoted to each other. Hannah reminds me of Catherine. Never considered a beauty, but kind and soft-hearted. One day, when she was a young woman, I had to intervene on her behalf and give her a little push so that she would see her suitor for what he was, a scoundrel, a disgrace to his uniform." He sneezed again. Abigail chuckled. "Bless you, Mr. Blessing?" Abigail, almost afraid to ask, "What about Nadia?" He caught her inference and replied, "Oh, yes, the cat. Well, it was just a way of coming through. It was the only way available. I knew a little cat wouldn't frighten you, and I was sure you would take me in. As for the name you call her, I was trying to tell you my name, Aidan, but you heard it backwards, I'm afraid. Nadia." He smiled as he reflected. "Once I came through as a mouse, briefly. Nimble creatures, quite useful for the purpose at the time, scurrying in and out of all those clocks." Then he laughed. "If I'd have come through as a mouse, surely you'd have swatted me with a broom." And she continued more seriously, "How did you—" Aidan finishes. "Die?" She nodded. He cocked his head and bowed. "Quite unceremoniously. I would like to say that I died, saber in hand, defending a woman's honor, or heroically on the field of battle. But alas, I died of a congestion of the chest. Rather mundane, I should think." They looked at each other, eyes locked. Abigail felt an inexplicable release within her. Aidan could not tell her that he already knew her touch, her smell, but he knew the truth. He wanted her to stay, but it would have to be her choice. Abigail asked Aidan, even though she knew the answer, "Did you build this house?" Aidan nodded. "Do you like it?" Abigail closed her eyes and sighed. "Oh, yes, very much." Aidan took a step toward her and inquired politely, "May I kiss your hand?" Unafraid, Abigail extended her hand and whispered, "Yes." But just as his lips touched her hand, Abigail heard a blaring sound, so loud and so in contrast to the peace she was feeling. It persisted and pounded in her ears. She drew back and held her hands to her ears. For a moment she saw a flashing red light. Strange people surrounded her as she lay in the wreck. Her car was smashed. She was in it, mangled and helpless. The strangers were talking to her, comforting her. She tried to speak, but all she could manage was, "Blessing, Blessing." One of the strangers called out, "I think she wants a priest." Abigail just smiled and closed her eyes. Then she heard a voice say, "You can stay." She knew where she was going. Some time later, at the Blessing house, Mr. Rogers paid a visit. The house seemed empty. He used his key and entered. In the parlor, he saw 2 cats sitting on the mantel. One was Nadia, and the other an earthy beauty with red-orange fur tinted by the heavens, with eyes the color of honey. On the mantel, on the other side of the carved cherubs, was chiseled A.J.S., Mr. Rogers winked at the cats, and as he turned to leave, whispered, "I hope you will let me come back some day to stay."